Thank you. The elder tree is contrary. It's the tree of protection and healing, but it is also the witch's tree you cannot trust. The elder mother who lives within is the tree's protector and guardian, but she cannot protect that tree from the influence of witches who will shape-shift into that form to use for their own magic. And in the village and in the countryside, times were tense. Farmers were reporting that something or someone was sucking their dairy cows. They were sickly and thin. It seemed to be sucking the very life out of them. Their milk yields were down, and what milk they could get from these cows was little, watery, thin. There were mutterings and whisperings in the local village and the countryside, on the farmsteads. Witchcraft, old magic. But none saw the shuffling shadow of the elder there in the hedgerows, in the woods, or there at night, sliding between their cows as they gently grazed the pastures. That there was an old woman, an old wise woman, who could always sense the shadow of the elder. And she'd warn her son, who was a farmer. There they all lived, the family on the farm. She'd say, mark my words, there's an elder about. So when news reached their ears as to what was happening to their neighbors, she told her son, go out tonight, keep a watch over the cows, and look out for the elder. And he, knowing how wise his mother's words were, he listened, and he went out that night to keep watch over the cows. But it was early autumn. There was that chill, that sticky dampness in the air that clung to your clothes and your face and the trees and the leaves. And he'd worked hard that day. The last thing he wanted to do was be out there in that sticky dampness of evening, where the moon shone up high in the sky, lighting everything up with a pearly glow. He was tired, chilled, and he longed for his bed. And as he sat there, he listened to that gentle lowing and mooing from his cows as they shifted there, slowly moving over the pastures with the moonlight shining on their backs. And he gently was lulled to sleep. He woke some time later with a start. Something didn't seem to be quite right. And there, he saw it ahead of him. There, lurking on the edges of the herd, was a tree, shining silver from the moonlight, tall and erect, its canopy of leaves lighting up that black sky with the reflected light of the moon. And he could see with horror it was creeping, shuffling towards the herd. It was an elder. He leapt to his feet and began to holler, shout at the cows, to try and move them from the upper pastures down the track towards the lower pasture, not far from the house. But they were a disorderly herd of cows, and he worked hard for the rest that night as they trotted here and there, and eventually he managed to move them from the upper pastures down through the track, squeezing them through, eventually reaching the edges of the lower pasture. And as the sun rose high in the sky, the break of a new day, he managed to get the last unruly cow through the gate of the lower pasture. He was chilled to the bone. He longed for his bed. And as he reached to lock that gate, he saw it was broken. So with a sigh, he sank down, picked up a stone and propped it up against the gate to keep it closed, and then turned and walked down the path back to the house. On entering, he met his mother wife and daughter in the hallway. And they had the anxious question in their eyes of, well, was all well last night? And he shook his head as if reading their minds, reading those unspoken questions, and said no. And he told them what he had seen and what he had done, and that the cows would now be safe there in the lower pasture. But his mother, that old wise woman, shook her head. And she said, oh no, son. Oh no. That elder tree has seen what you've done. It'll be in the lower pastures before the end of day. But he said, I don't care. I'm to my bed. And he turned from them and made his way up the stairs into the bedroom, where he flopped down to the bed and soon was snoring fast asleep. It was some time later he awoke to the sound of shouting. And as he came to, became more aware, he heard downstairs his daughter's voice. Father, father, come now, the tree isn't amongst the cows in the past, come. Immediately shot out of bed, out of the room, down the stairs, and there, straight into the kitchen, he saw through the window which overlooked the lower pasture. He saw that tree that was staggering, shuffling, jerking its way through the herd of cows that were lowing and mooing and distressed and were restless, running here and running there. He said to his wife, get me a silver button on my Sunday jacket. To his daughter, my gun. And they did as they were told. His mother, in the meantime, had gone out to the shed in the back and had picked up a shovel. By the time she made her way back into the house, into the hallway, she could see her son had loaded up that silver button into the barrel of that gun. Her son turned to his wife and said, keep the door ready, open. If I miss that tree, my life will depend on it. And he left the house, made his way up the track towards the lower pasture. He could see before him that tree staggering, jerking its way through the herd, and his hands began to shake. For he'd never seen anything so horrible in all his life. And he was trembling within. When he got within firing range, he lifted his gun, took aim, and pulled the trigger. The kickback of that rifle was so powerful that it flew out of his hands, but that silver button flew through the air at great speed, but missed the target, but nipped off some leaves and branches of the tree that turned around and screamed with agony and pain, and then saw him. He could see the face in the bark. He could see the fury in the bark and the trunk of that tree as it began to stagger, jerk its way towards him, moving with thud, 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 crashing through the fence, splintering the wood with a great bang. And then he turned and began to run. And as he ran back towards the house, he could hear the thudding of that tree, gaining on him, getting closer and closer and closer. He hollered to his wife to shut that door as soon as he was through it. And she was ready. And just as he flew through the door, he felt the tips of the branches on the nape of his neck, and his wife shut the door with such force it caught his coattails and jerked him to a stop. But the two of them heard tips of the branches as they scraped down the door, the wood of the door. And then it began to circle the house, scraping the tips of those branches on the wood of the door, the brickwork, and then the panes of glass of the window, squealing and scratching and hollering and screeching as it circled around the house. Both the farmer's wife and daughter clung to each other in fear. But the old wise one was ready. She went into the kitchen and, taking that shovel, She shoved it into the hearth of the fire and pulled out burning embers. Then she shouted to her granddaughter to come and unbolt the back door, which her granddaughter did, with trembling hands pulling it back, and the door slowly opened. The old woman could see the tree was there. She hollered to the tree, and with a steady hand, with that shovel in her hand, she took position, and she stayed there on the doorstep, waiting. And the tree turned and began to scream and holler and coming towards her, thudding, thudding, gaining speed. And then, as it was almost upon her, she then shoved those glowing embers, which landed on the tree, and immediately took light with flame flickering, smoke bellowing up into the sky. The tree screamed with agony and began to stagger backwards, waving back and forth, away from the house. And the old woman was joined by her family on the doorstep, and they watched as that tree, screaming and more now flaming, filling up the whole sky with smoke and fire, slowly collapsed and seemed to have a big bonfire, and then was nothing. Eventually just collapsing onto the ground, scorching it, and was just eventually smoke trailing up to the sky. When they reached the spot, they saw that all that remained of the tree was grey ash. And the old woman took that shovel and she made the sign of the cross. And much later, they dug up the earth and dug up the ash and took it well away from the boundaries of the farm, where they buried it deep on common land. And when news reached the ears of the neighbors, those other farmers, they rejoiced and they celebrated. They said, who was the witch? Was it witchcraft? And they soon found out that one of the elderly women, a lady called Ratty Liddy, who lived in a little cottage on the edge of the village, wasn't seen for some time. But when the door was broken open, there they found her burnt remains.